Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! Let me start with some great news. I'm extremely proud and humbled that Turan Tales has been shortlisted for the Publisher Podcast Awards in 2 categories: Best Podcast Launch and Best Local and Community Podcast. In the first category, so Best Podcast Launch, we are up against podcasts with real budgets produced by Politico, the Financial Times and Bloomberg, which makes this an even bigger achievement given that my podcast is literally made in my kitchen in Almaty. I'm hoping to travel to London for the awards ceremony in July, so if any of you are planning to be there, please let me know. This week, we're diving into the fascinating history of Central Asian cinema and the ways Central Asia and Central Asians have been portrayed in foreign films. We will explore colonial tropes in portrayals of the region during Soviet times, how these representations influenced Central Asians' self-image, and how they changed after the fall of the Soviet Union. We will also talk about different waves in Central Asian cinema throughout the 20th century and into the present day. Joining us is the best possible person to discuss these issues, Assiya Issemberdiyeva. She is a Kazakh film critic and researcher, currently completing her PhD at Queen Mary University of London, where her thesis examines representations of Central Asia in Soviet wartime cinema. She's a member of the Kazakhstan Film Critics Association, curator of Kazakh Film Week in London, and producer and author of the Kinoscope video essay series. Especially for you, I asked Assiya to compile a list of her favorite Central Asian films, and she did. I haven't watched most of them yet, so I'm very excited to start the marathon. You can find the list in this week's post on my newsletter's website, turantales.substack.com. And now, welcome to Turan Talks. Hello, Assiya. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Let me start by asking you, what are the main cliches and the main stereotypes that are projected onto the region or that are told about the region in foreign movies? Obviously, there aren't many foreign movies that look at Central Asia, but those that exist, like what are the main cliches that they're using?
Yes, that's a great question because indeed there are very few movies about Central Asian cultures or countries in the West or elsewhere, but main cliches in Western films, for example, the TV shows, there are some mentions of Central Asian countries, and they come from, in general, from Soviet cliches or cliches about the Soviet Union in the West, for example. So Central Asia in the Soviet period was a margin, a periphery of the big empire. That's why it didn't get much exposure in the world imagination. And it was a deliberate Soviet policy when the nations or ethnicities had to merge in the end into the one Soviet nationality, right? And the model of that modern Soviet nationality was Russian nationality. That's why the white Russian features or Slavic features kind of represented the Soviet Union to the wider world. And Central Asians, being of another race and having a distinct culture, they were very marginalized, and until the 1990s, I don't think many countries in the world heard about Central Asian countries. So right now in the social media, we know that there are different trends and different stereotypes about Central Asia, especially about Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan being like this exotic, nomadic, steppe or mountain featured, these countries who are exoticized mostly. And Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, these kind of cultures that are prone to sedentary lifestyle, they are exoticized as the place of Middle Age architecture or some Muslim traditions, for example. And I don't think there's something that goes beyond that. I would be happy to speak about stereotypes that prevailed during the Soviet period about Central Asian cultures, because until the 1950s, mostly Soviet Europeans, how the academic literature calls them, or white Soviets, they represented Central Asia in Soviet culture through the outsider gaze. And that representation had its own kind of features.
So what was the representation like? How were Central Asians, or how was Central Asia seen in this Soviet representation, or white Soviet representation?
Basically, if we go back to the 1920s, when the cinema was brought to Central Asia during the Soviet period, we can see the first kind of imaginations of Central Asia differ vastly. For example, the steppe regions like Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, they are viewed differently from the Uzbek, for example, or Tajik cultures. And films like Victor Turin's famous Turksip, it's a film about the Turksip Railroad, the construction of it. But if we go to the narrative, the main kind of narrative going on there is how the white Soviets came and woke up this land, this hungry steppe that was sleeping. People were asleep, cattle was asleep, like dogs were asleep, and yurts, they were paralleled with mazars or tombs, and life in general in the steppe was shown as like equal to death almost. So we can see this representation of steppe regions not only regarding Central Asian geography, but also, for example, Mongolia, which is also a nomadic society. Vsevolod Podovskin's Storm Over Asia also have a similar narrative and iconography, where Mongolian yurts are also kind of paralleled with their tombs. And also, almost always, nomadic societies, they are shown as backward and somewhat uncivilized. And always there is a white Russian or white figure who comes and rescues them from this backwardness. When it comes to, for example, representation of Uzbekistan, in the 20s, there were films that were like Orientalist exotica, in one word. So these films like Minaret of Death, for example, they were almost like a fairy tales, imaginations of this exoticized East, which borrowed very familiar Western stereotypes about Middle East, for example. So this trend continued until the 1940s and 50s, where films like Nasreddin in Bukhara, made by Yakov Protazanov, for example, it borrows directly from films about 1001 Nights, like the one made in the 1920s with Douglas Fairbanks, and then in the 40s. So, like, some scenes are identical entirely. Not only the narrative is similar, but also this kind of imagination of Eastern cities, and like Bukhara, for example, and the emirs having this decadent lifestyle, and Central Asian men being possessed by this culture that is very backward and foreign, and religion, Islam, was often seen as something very reactionary. So that's kind of the two frames depicting Central Asia, where nomadic societies are seen differently from sedentary societies, and it has a hierarchy. Like the Soviet imagination was always built on the hierarchy of the peoples, of cultures. So I guess the nomadic peoples were placed on the lowest category of this hierarchy of cultures. And things started changing only when local Central Asian filmmakers started making films about their own cultures. So here I just want to say that it's not to say that before the Soviet modernization there was no film in Central Asia. There were films made in Uzbekistan, for example, from 1908. Khodaybergen Divonov was making films, and filmmakers like Nabi Ganiyev Nabighaniev or Suleiman Khodjaev, they were also making films in the 1920s, but their careers were cut short, especially Suleiman Khodjaev and Divanov. They were executed by the Soviet state during the Great Terror. And Nabighaniev was also persecuted, but then released from prison in the late 1930s, like 39, and he started working again in the Tashkent studio, but he was totally dependent on the Soviet control, and his earlier fascination with his own culture and showing his own people with a greater kind of agency was diminished and replaced by folkloric narratives that he had to work on during the Soviet period. What I want to say is that the main stereotypes were that these Soviet Eastern cultures, they are different from us, their religion is different, they are backward, and they need the Soviet rescue. That was the main stereotype, but also it showed in the choice of topics, like the Soviet cultures, they couldn't be represented through history. They should be represented only through ethnographic or folkloric material. I think that was the main stereotype.
Okay, so when we look at the development of Central Asian cinema, what were the main issues or the main themes that were used in this very early Central Asian cinema, so before the Soviet times? What were the films about mostly? And how did those topics changed later?
So, for example, if we go back to Khodaibergen Divanov, his films were documentary films, and they showed the life in Khiva, Fergana. And regarding Suleiman Khodjaev and Nabighaniyev's films, they were made during the Soviet period, the early Soviet period, but their films were showing prominent agency-driven Uzbek characters who would be bringing the torch of socialism or modernity to Uzbekistan, to Uzbek people. And that was kind of not forbidden, but not very approved by the Moscow, very centralized Moscow film management, which pushed one main narrative that these Central Asian peoples, they were saved and rescued, but also led to the modernity by specifically white Russian, white Soviet peoples. So they had to be saved by the outsider, the main characters who were agency-driven and powerful. They could not be Uzbeks. That was, I think, main problem there. And we can trace this problem throughout the existence of the Soviet cinema. Because if we look at films like The Songs of Abay, for example, made in 1940s, and Jambul, made in 1950s, and also the films that were postponed during the 40s, like Avaliyev, for example, in Uzbek film. So how these films were postponed or changed very specifically by the film management of the time, the film committee first in the 40s, and then the Ministry of Cinematography in the 1950s. And these institution had different levels of censorship. So the first one is when you, as a studio, you have your own kind of approval system. You approve the screenplay and you send the screenplay to Moscow. And this film agency, film committee, for example, in the 40s, it has its own screenplay department, which will receive the screenplay, read it through, and give their notes and remarks. And you have to follow them and submit another version of your screenplay. So if we go back to the first versions of screenplays written during these times and the remarks made to them, and the second versions that were remakes of the first screenplays, we can see that there are different levels of censorship, and there are some kind of very good, sometimes criticism on the screenplays. But almost all of them have one feature, which is the representation of not only Central Asians, but the representation of Russians in these films. So this was a very sensitive topic, and people in the screenplay departments, they would be reading it through especially for that representation. And say, for example, in the example of the Songs of Abay, here the Russian character Dolgopolov, he seems to be too passive. He seems to be benefiting from Abay's generosity. This cannot be true, because Kazakhs, including Abay, benefited from Russian revolutionary ideas. So this person, he brings the culture here. He's the powerful figure here, and his image should be more prominent. And then Mukhtar Awezov goes back and rewrites the screenplay accordingly. And same goes to Jambul, same goes to other screenplays of the time. And we can see that all Soviet films of that period have this white savior figure, which always guides.
So how did it influence Central Asian countries and people of Central Asia? I remember I spoke to Hamid Ismailov a couple of months ago, and he said that, growing up in Soviet Uzbekistan, he always felt that being white was somehow better and somehow desirable, that everyone had their white version of their name even. So can you tell us a little bit more about how this kind of portrayal of Central Asians and Russians influenced how Central Asians saw themselves?
Yes, that's why I'm interested in this topic, because as Chatterjee, for example, says, colonialism never ends with countries colonized getting their freedoms or independence, right? So because colonialism is not only conquering the lands, the people, but also their consciousness, their culture, and penetrating their identity as well, right? So that's why when colonialism ends in political terms, or almost ends, this discursive pattern, it cannot end in one day or 10 years or 30 years even, which we can see now today, even especially in the cities where Central Asians were living next to like Russians or other white populations. They would feel discriminated. They would have less opportunities for better jobs, for better education. They would feel themselves less. I hear a lot of stories of my parents when they studied in the cities. They are being scolded in the buses because they spoke Kazakh, for example. People would shout at them and say, speak on the normal human language, etc. So people at that time, my parents' generation, could not stay in the cities because, like, for example, in a city like Almaty, only 16% of the population could be Kazakhs, ethnically Kazakh. And other than that...
That was a policy, right?
Yes. Yeah. So people like my parents could not have stayed in the city, although they studied there. So they always felt like the city is the best of the best is for white people, not for us. So we study, but we are sent to work in the peripheries. So that was their understanding of the hierarchies. And I think that also sits in the imagination of filmmakers still, not in everybody's, but if we look at orientalized or self-orientalizing representation of Central Asians in contemporary films, we can see that, for example, in Kazakh films, often Russian-speaking characters, they are seen as cultured, as a more forward-looking, progressive, and also having more money, etc. And Kazakh-speaking characters, they are seen as backward, less cultured, having less money, and always benefiting from those who speak Russian. So that continues, especially in commercial cinema until today. And I don't think that filmmakers nowadays consciously try to make it so, but this is sitting in the psyche so deep that they don't actually understand that they are representing these Russian-speaking and locally speaking people in a very different mode. So that's one kind of representation frame of that. And the second is even the makeup. If we look at contemporary films, for example, last month we saw the premiere of the film Tamerlan, The Last Conqueror, right? So
yes.
if we look at the main character, like Tamerlan, Christian Mortensen plays this character, and he has a specific makeup his eyes are made more prominent than they are because he is representing the Uzbek character, apparently, right? And if we go back and look at a Kazakh film called Kazakh Khanate, Diamond Sword, there is a representation of Kazakh and Uzbek Khans. So Janibek and Kirey Khan, they are faced with Abil Khair Khan, Uzbek Abil Khair Khan, and then Shaybanid or Uzbek Khans of the time. And all the Shaybani Khans, they also have that makeup around their eyes. They are made more prominent by using makeup. And this actually goes back to the Soviet times when Nasruddin in Bukhara, played by Lev Sverdlin. Lev Sverdlin also has this similar makeup. And then if we go back to the 1920s, Minaret of Death and other films of the 1920s, all the Soviet European actors who play Uzbek characters, they also have those kind of makeup. And that harks back to Western cinema, 1001 Nights films. Douglas Fairbanks has a similar makeup. Feminization of Middle Eastern men was translated into feminization of Uzbek or Tajik men as well. And the Tajik film studio, for example, in the Soviet period was a fairy tale factory, as we call it, because it was producing mainly fairy tales based on 1001 Nights stories. And all the representation of men there, they don't represent Tajiks, they represent our Arabs, but not real Arabs, but in the imagination of the West. So we can see that this goes back very deep, and these little things, they still carry on, and we can see them even now.
Do we have any examples of films or film directors who would go against this censorship during the Soviet times? Maybe some of them managed to kind of trick the censors and push through their ideas and, their representations of Central Asians and Central Asia. Were there any good examples that we can now look at and say that this is what Central Asia looks like?
Yeah, obviously. As I said, especially from the 1950s and particularly in the 1960s and 70s, we have this growth of Central Asian talent on the insistence and advocacy of local communists, the administration of Central Asian republics. Many young people go to Moscow, study in VGIK as filmmakers, as cameramen, actors, etc., and they come back and they make films. For example, in the 60s, we have Kyrgyz Miracle, which produced so many authentic films that actually show the beauty and divergence of Kyrgyz culture, for example. Especially, for example, I like Tolomush Okeyev's films. One of them is Bakai's Jalao, or I think the English title is The Sky of Our Childhood. And that film shows not only inner world of the main character, but also the whole cultural richness of Kyrgyz nomadic culture. If we go to, for example, Kazakhstan, we have Shaken Aymanov, who produces Zemlya Otsov, or the Land of the Fathers, for example, which shows not only the respect for arwahs, how we call them, the spirits of the deceased, but also it suggests that the Kazakh idea of the native land or the land of the fathers is actually not the whole Soviet Union, but the Kazakh land. Or there are many films made in the 60s and 70s in the genre of Easterns. And the Eastern genre is devised to show the historical revolutionary struggle of Bolsheviks against Basmachi or local reactionary groups. And those films always carry the praise for Bolshevik main characters. But even in those films, if we look at Abdullah Qarsakbayev's films made in Kazakhstan, Тревожное утро, and another was Pagonya za Hamitom, these films have villains who are Basmachi or anti-socialist, anti-Bolshevik figures, but they are very rich in terms of character. They carry culture with themselves, And you often see those films and their lines even are very bold. And as a Kazakh person, like growing up in Kazakhstan and watching these films, I was always more fascinated with the bad guys in these films because they carry this Kazakh old culture and they are always stand higher than these Bolshevik figures who are also nice, but the Bolshevik figures in these films lack depth, whereas these anti-Bolshevik figures, they have this very bold lines and bold characters and the representation of the most interesting human traits. I guess even if narratively these films couldn't overstep censorship boundaries, but even within those allowed narratives, they played with character personalization, language, the depiction of landscape, for example. In almost all films of the 60s and 70s, almost all, for example, Kazakh films, they have somewhere depiction of balbaltas, which is very ancient stone figures, which harks back to the memory, like historical memory. And if we go to the 70s and look at Kızılcık, the most celebrated Kazakh film, it is a folklore-based film, but even in that film, we have this tendency to historify the folklore, because even the titles, the first title that comes to the screen is in runic script, which is a very old Turkic script, right? And the second comes Arabic script, which Central Asian countries used until 1920s. And then only third comes the Cyrillic title, Kızılcık. So even from the first titles, we can see that the filmmakers try to say that this is not only this time, our culture goes very back. And even in that folkloric narrative, we can see that characters pass through lands with the mazars, with the balbaltas, and they make references to the native land, to the peoples, etc. So basically, subtly, they go against this Soviet narrative.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. And tell me, what has changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Has a sort of decolonial perspective gained more traction and more prominence? Or, I mean, you already mentioned that to an extent, those kind of old colonial cliches are still being reproduced. But how the films and the themes changed after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
I think I want to go a little back to before the collapse of the Soviet Union, because in the late 1980s, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, a prominent, powerful movement emerged in Kazakh cinema called the New Kazakh Wave. And if we look at films made by New Kazakh Wave filmmakers, they defy Soviet representations, and not only in terms of the representation of ethnic characters, but also defy the Soviet film conventions, defy the language of Soviet film. So they show a very different Soviet Union, and their representation of people and cultures is not like centered on ethnicity, but it's centered on humanity. It's centered on a personality, and they are very intimate. This was a defiance of this socialist realism, where all characters had to be typified and represent some type of citizens. And I think in that, even Central Asian filmmakers already before the start of the Soviet Union started showing defiance. And after the collapse, we have to understand that in the 1990s, the economical side of filmmaking was in a very dire condition, because, as I mentioned, the Soviet system was very centralized, especially film was approved and decided in Moscow, and Moscow had all the budget for films. So the all infrastructure centered on Moscow. So every republic had to go to Moscow once and defend their projects for the next year. So in a year, Central Asian republics in the 60s and 70s had allowance to do like 3 or 4 films in a year. In the late 80s, in Kazakhstan, our studio had a chance to make 7-8 films a year. But that was like a maximum. And in the 1990s, because the whole like system of budgeting and financing, it collapsed. The new republics had to figure out other more important issues. Filmmaking was almost on hold, and there were films, but even in that condition, there were films, for example, made in 1990s, Abay, for example, the same topics, but remade just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So if we have in the 40s, the Songs of Abay, which represents Abay in this Soviet-reliant perspective, in the 90s, 1992 or 91 even, we have Ardahan Mirkulov's film Abay's Youth, which shows Abay and his relationship with his father in a different light. And in that film, for example, a mosque is a symbol of the unification of the nation. So the film starts with building a mosque and it ends with the building completed. So it's like the building of the nation. And in films like Jambul, for example, in the 50s, Efim Zigan made Jambul in a very propagandistic way. That Jambul was just a mouthpiece to Soviet propaganda. And the Youth of Jambul that was made in 1995, it again reconstructs Jambul's figure and goes back to his younger years and shows that Jambul was a very authentic Kazakh improvisator or aytыс ақын, whose main ideas in his poems were about unifying the people again with all these different tribes unifying into one nation. So again, we can, even in that very difficult period, we can see that filmmakers already start to thinking about unifying, building the nation. And with time, things changed financially, but also culturally. The new generation of filmmakers arrived to the cinema. And right now, we are evolving and we have a very different perspectives among our filmmakers. And of course, there are films that react to Soviet narratives and mainly center on historical topics. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, like all these countries, it is both state-sponsored, but also it also comes from the filmmakers themselves. One example is Satybaldy Narımbetov, who made 2 films about anti-colonial or decolonial topics. One is Mustafa Shokay, about the leader of Kokand autonomy who had to flee to France and died in Germany. He was of Kazakh origin, but he was like one of the leaders of Kokand autonomy facing or fighting against Bolsheviks. And the second was a manat about Yermukhanbek Makhanov, a historian who was also repressed during the Soviet period, who wanted to show how Kazakh people fought against Russian colonialism in the 19th century. So if we look at the themes of these films are kind of to the liking of the new nation states, because our Central Asian nation states, they are formulated as nation states during the Soviet period, and they have the whole understanding of nation states are based on the Stalinist imaginations of nations and states. That's why it seems to current nation states in Central Asia a survival issue to make films that show our nations in a very primordial form. Because Stalinist primordial ideas of nations kind of was entrenched into our psyche. And to legitimize our nations or our states right now, everyone wants to cling into some history that says, yes, we are Kazakhs, we have lived here for centuries since the immemorial. Same goes to every Central Asian nation. So that's one, it's a consequence of Soviet policies, but also it's a reaction against Soviet policies because, as I said, if we look at nations as ethnographiable and historifiable, this is the term from Fatima Tobin-Roni, who actually looked at representation of colonized peoples in the Western cinema. And she uses these terms like ethnographiable for peoples who are colonized, because as Hegel once said, Africa is beyond history or outside history. So Africa is outside history and all other colonized peoples are outside history. And historifiable are only Western countries or peoples because they have always progressing histories that lead to this modernity. And the same approach was used during the Soviet period, where Russians had this historifiable dimension, and all the historical films about military or state leaders were mainly made about Russian state leaders or military leaders. And minority figures, minority histories were represented through poets, through folkloric figures like Nasreddin or Aldar-Kuse or Kazbek, etc., which are like not really a history, which just shows that there was a past, but the past was either despotic or kind of exotica. So because of this long period of Central Asian filmmakers trying to make films about their khans, about their emirs and batirs, but their screenplays being rejected all the time, they have this urge to make films about their military leaders, khans, emirs, whatever you have, like figures like Tamerlan, even now. Because it seems like there is this plast of history that is not told, that was kept from our cultures, that was kind of dismissed, and even populations in Central Asian countries, especially older populations, they don't actually know their histories. That's why there's this urge to make films about history. I guess that's one reaction to the Soviet narratives that we can clearly see now. But of course, it's not only historical figures, but also like contemporary films. Right now, there are different genres that are prominent in Central Asia, different movements. There is a clear distinction between art house cinema and commercial cinema, and we can talk about it more. Yeah.
Well, that was my next question. So what about independent cinema or art house cinema? What kind of waves, what kind of new figures, new directors we see in Central Asia? Because we kind of focused in our discussion on, this opposition or this like reaction to what the Soviet Union or Russia was thinking about Central Asia. And can we just talk about the Central Asian cinema now as it is? Like what kind of issues are important? What kind of good films are being made? Mm-hmm. Maybe what are your favorite films contemporarily?
Yes, I have many favorite films. I probably will talk about some of them, but I want to start with the main kind of topics that are prominent now. If we look at Central Asian cinema in general, I have a very limited knowledge about contemporary Turkmen cinema and contemporary Tajik cinema as well, I'm afraid. From Tajik cinema, one of my favorite filmmakers is Jamshid Usmanov. His films made during the early 2000s, like Angel on the Right, for example, his films are very interesting in terms of its own kind of feel of rural Tajik life and this moral portrait of Tajik people. And because they are very authentic and very honest, I admired his films, but now I think he lives in France and hasn't made films about Tajikistan for many years. Apart from that, for example, my knowledge of Tajik cinema, contemporary Tajik cinema, is very limited. In terms of Uzbek cinema, we can see that Uzbek cinema since 1990s was mostly market-oriented or like locally oriented. So a lot of films made by Uzbek Film Studio and other private studios, they are centered on family issues, the representation of
Kalinkas.
Yes, exactly. Of women, the problem between like this fight between yene or mother-in-law and Kilin, daughter-in-law, and how Kilinkas are almost always rebellious, but in the end they have to submit to the order, etc. This topic, by the way, is very prominent in Kyrgyz and Kazakh cinema as well, especially commercial Kazakh and Kyrgyz cinema, TV series. They are inundated by this topic. And this is like Kilinkas rule the Central Asian cinema right now. But apart from that, one emerging trend is filmmakers who make films about women in general. So even one of my favorite filmmakers from Central Asia, Akhtan Armqubat, his last film, The Black, Red and Yellow, it is centered on a woman. And if we look at his earlier films, like his first film that made him like famous, Beshkempir, it is almost like an autobiography. It is centered on a boy growing up, right? So if in the 80s, 90s, our filmmakers, Central Asian filmmakers, art house filmmakers right now I'm talking about, if they made films about coming of age and it was centered on mainly boys, right now there is emerging trend looking at women's issues and beyond Kirinka and Yine. For example, Sharipa Urazbaeva is one of my favorite filmmakers from Kazakhstan. She made several films, and my favorite film of hers is The Red Pomegranate, which is about a woman who has to fight for justice. And she actually is more morally upright than her husband, and she fights for justice for her. It's not her son, but it's the son of her husband. So basically, it's not her own child, but she fights for him more and better than her husband does. And these kind of characters, they, I think, show Central Asian women for who they are, with their problems right now, where they have to struggle for survival economically, but also struggle morally, because the capitalist society also is corrupted, and they have to fight for justice for themselves and for the kids and for the future. Another favorite film of mine is called Madina by Ayjan Qasimbek. She is also an emerging filmmaker. She made this film about a woman in Aktau who also raises a child alone. And her issues like trying to survive as a dancer and raising her child, but also fighting for her younger brother who was assaulted by a man. This topic of women having agency, trying to do something, and being the moral center of the stories, I think they are very true to what Central Asia is now, because I see this kind of woman every day in my everyday interactions. Also, it's interesting that filmmakers like Adilkhan Irshanov, who are famous for making films about men, like male-centered films, they are also trying to make films about women. For example, his film called Ul Bolsun is also about a woman who fights for her sister, younger sister, who's married to some older guy, and she rescues her sister. Also, she tries to seek help from other men, but in the end, help never arrives, and she has to do everything to save her sister, and she does. And auteur filmmakers, Nariman Turibayev, for example, recently he also made a film about a woman. It's less like a powerful figure, but again, she also tries to survive and makes her difficult choices. And this trend, I'm very happy with it. I think we need more films centered on women and that are coming not only in the commercial cinema market, but also coming from serious auteur filmmakers who have been male-centered for a long time.
I see, unfortunately, we have to end our conversation, which was absolutely fascinating. And thank you so much for this conversation and sharing your knowledge with us. Can I also ask you to maybe send me a list of your favorite Central Asian movies so I can share it with our listeners? And maybe if our listeners get a chance to see them, they will have a ready list of your favorite films. Can we agree on that?
Absolutely, yes. I will send you a list.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Assiya. And yeah, all the best to you.
Thank you.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.